Hi everyone, welcome to the video lecture series of Object-Oriented Programming. In this video lecture, we will be discussing about the topic methods. Methods are similar to functions in C programming. Or we can say that method is exactly what we call functions in C programming language. We will see how to write methods, how to pass parameters, how to call a method, how to define a method, etc. So how can we define a method? A method can be defined as a block of code which only runs when it is called. This definition, we know its meaning, right? That is, we are creating a block of code. Block of code means when we will call something as a block in programming, when we use a pair of curly brackets. When we open one pair of curly bracket and when we close it, everything in between that pair of curly brackets is considered as a block. So curly brackets are used for creating blocks. So when we have to create methods, what we'll do is we will name that block so that we can refer to that block whenever it is required. So we'll create one block, we'll give one name so that we can use that block several times whenever we need it. And this point also we have to keep in mind. Creating a block doesn't mean that that block will work automatically. That means if we are creating a block or a method, if that method needs to be executed, we have to call it explicitly. That is, we have to call it separately. And also we can pass additional data to a method, and they are known as parameters. I just want to remind you, methods are functions. Okay, the functions that we have studied in C programming language. The same thing is known as methods in Java, only the name is different. Now why we have to use methods? These are the two important reasons or advantages of using methods. One is code reusability. Once we have written a method, that method can be used any number of times whenever we need it. There is no limit in the number of times we can reuse it. And also our program becomes more understandable and it becomes easy to modify as well as maintain the program. And think like this. Suppose we are going to develop a software. If you are going to write all the lines of code in the single main method or main function in C programming, there is only one function or one method in our program. So if suppose one error occurs, it will be really difficult for us to find out where that error is and what that error is. And also if we want to modify that program, we have to go through that entire lines of code within the same function or same method, and then we have to think where we have to modify and what will happen if we insert a new line inside this function and all. So the modification and the readability of the program becomes very complex when we don't split the program into methods. So that is why we are using these methods. We can think of a program where we are going to find out or calculate this equation. This equation represents the combination and permutation, a mathematical formula for finding out the combination as well as the permutation. Suppose we want to write a program whose output must be the result of this equation, this formula. So as you can see, we have to find out factorial of n, then r factorial, and then n minus r factorial. Then we have to multiply r factorial and n minus factorial. Then we have to divide n factorial by the multiplication or the product of r and n minus r factorial. So suppose we are going to write lines of code to find out factorial of n. So first of all, we have to write the lines of code for finding out the factorial of n. Then again, if we are going to write the same lines of code, we have to repeat to find out the factorial of r. Then again we have to find out n minus r factorial. So then we will once again repeat those lines of code to find out the factorial. So instead of that, what if we are writing the factorial of the codes for finding out the factorial of a number and we are keeping it apart or aside? Okay, we are naming we are writing a method, we are giving it a name, say factorial, and we are writing the lines of code to find the factorial of a number. Whatever may be the number we are passing as parameter, this method will give us back the factorial of that number. So we are creating a block of code, we are naming it, and we are keeping it aside. So whenever in our program we need to find out the factorial, we can just call that method. That's enough. We don't want to repeat the same lines of code again and again. So if you want to calculate n factorial by r factorial in n minus r factorial, what we have to do? We have to just write one method which calculates the factorial of any number that we pass as parameter. We are keeping it apart. Okay. Then if you want to find out n factorial, what you have to do? Just call that factorial method, pass this value of n as the parameter, then that method will give us back the value of n factorial. Similarly, if you want to find out the factorial of r, just call that method, pass this value r, we will get back the result as r factorial. Similarly, n minus r factorial also. So we are reusing the code once written 3 times here. We are not repeating the lines of code again and again. We are reusing the lines of code once written 3 times. I hope you understood the usage of method. So similarly in this, to solve this equation also, here also we need to use this factorial 2 times. So instead of repeating the lines of code for finding out the factorial, why can't we save those lines of code as a method, and why can't we use that again and again? That is the basic idea of using methods. So by using methods, we can reuse the same lines of code again and again, any number of times we need, and it improves the readability of the program. Also, it becomes easy to modify the program. That means if you are writing a program as method, if we need to modify a portion of the program, we can concentrate only on that method that we need to modify instead of modifying the entire program. So the modification also becomes very easy when we write programs in methods. And when we talk about C programming as well as Java programming, the most important method is the main method, because if there is no main method, means our program will not be Now the different parts of a method. As we can see, a method will have method header as well as method signature. Method signature is also known as method body. Method body is a place where we write all the lines of code, or the lines of code that needs to be executed when we call a method, and it has to be enclosed within a pair of curly brackets. So we can define the method body or method signature as the lines of code that are written inside the pair of curly brackets in a method. Now coming to method header. Method header is what we need to understand properly. In Java, method header looks like this. There will be an access specifier. Access specifier decides whether this method is accessible by everybody or only by some people. So if it is public, this method can be accessed by anybody else. If it is private, only some people can access it. And who are those people? That we will study, but understand the meaning of access specifier. Access specifier means the word that specifies the access to this method. We can understand the meaning of that word, right? Access specifier means something that specifies the access. Then the return type, that you know, we have studied in other programming languages also. Return type means the type of the value the method is going to return. If the method returns an integer value, then return type must be int. If the method is going to return a double value, then the return type must be double. At the same time, if the method does not return anything, then the return type must be void. That you know, right? Then comes the method name. Name of the method. It is actually an identifier that is mentioned by the programmer. We can give any name to the method name, but only thing is the method name must begin with a small letter. As you can see in this example, the method name is given as sum and the first letter as a small letter. Okay. Then comes the pair of parentheses, inside which we have to write the parameter list, if any. It's not compulsory that every method must have a parameter list. We can write methods without parameters. That's also available or allowable in Java programming. That is, it's not compulsory every method must have some parameters. It's not compulsory like that. If there are any parameters, we have to mention that in this pair of parentheses that comes along with the method name. And all these together forms the method header. why we are saying that, why I have shown this figure is because we have to study something known as abstract class, abstract methods, interfaces, etc. in the upcoming sessions. There we need to know the difference between method signature and method header. So please understand this properly. Method header is the portion of the method that tells us the accessibility of the method, the return type of the method, the name of the method, and the parameter list. Method body or method signature is the lines of code that we write in that pair of curly brackets. Okay, and actually it is this method header that we want to know when we have to call a method, because if we want to call a method we must know the name of that method. Without knowing the name of method, how can we call it? Suppose you are sitting in a class, and if you want to call the persons, if you have to call a person sitting nearby you, without knowing his name, how can you call him? Okay, so a method must have a name. Secondly, so that name we will get from this method header. Then we want to know whether the method returns anything or not, because if the method is not returning anything, then we don't have to worry, we can just call that method. But if the method returns any value, we have to consider that, because when we call this method we must make sure that the value returned by that method will be available for us, so that we have to take care of that. Okay, and thirdly, how many parameters this method require, what are they, and in which order I have to use the parameters. In this example, this method requires two parameters, both of them are integers. So when I have to call this method, I must write sum, then inside the pair of parentheses I must include two parameters that of type integer. So the type of parameters and the order in which these parameters are written inside the pair of parentheses in method header are very important. If the first parameter is of type float and second parameters of type integer, when I call the method I must pass two parameters, out of which the first parameter must be a floating point number and second parameter must be an integer. So the order in which the parameters are written in the method header and the number of parameters are important, because all these things we need to know when we call a method. So for calling a method, we want to know the return type of the method, the name of the method, and the number of parameters, also the order of parameters in which it is written inside the pair of parentheses. And all these three things that we require to call a method are available only from the method header. So we can say it is this method header that determines how we have to call the method. So without seeing the method header, without knowing the method header, we won't be able to call a method. I hope that is clear. These are the explanations of method signature as well as different words that are there inside the method header that I have explained properly. So method body, parameter list, method name, return type, access specifier. Now we will see an example of using methods when we write Java program. So as mentioned in the previous session, everything in Java is inside a class. So the first thing that you have to do is to write a class. So you can see the word public coming here, that is the accessibility of the class. Then class is the keyword. Then I'm mentioning the class name as even odd. As you can see, the class name is beginning with a capital letter. In this class there are two words, class name consists of two words. So first letter of each word is in capital and there are no space between the class name. This is the naming convention followed by Java. All professional Java programmers will be following this naming convention. Okay, so when you get a Java program, if you see certain words beginning with a capital letter, we can make sure that it's a class. Okay, then we are writing the main method. So in this program there are two methods, one is the main method and other one is the find even odd. Okay, So inside the main method I am using scanner class. So these lines of code just don't focus. This is used to get the input from the keyboard, like our scanf function in C programming language. This is how we read value from keyboard, that we will study later, but just understand that this line is used to print. So when this line is executed, this statement will be printed on the key on the monitor. So when this line is displayed, the user will be entering a value from the keyboard. So suppose we want to read that value. For that we have to use something known as scanner. So this is its format of usage, I mean how to use scanner. So that for the time being just forget about it. Then see this, we have written this block of code here, this method here, but this method will not work automatically. If this method needs to be executed, we have to call it. Before calling this method, I need to know what is the method name, what does this method return, whether this method requires any parameter, etc. For that I need to look at the method header. So when I look at the method header, I came to know that the method name is find even odd, and as you can see, this method name consists of 3 words. The first word is completely in small letters, the remaining 2 words begins with a capital letter. That is again the naming convention followed by Java. When you write method name, if the method name is only 1 word, means everything must be in small letters. If the method name consists of more than 1 word, then the first letter of all the remaining words must be in capital. Okay, so this method name is find even odd. Then this method does not return anything because the return type is void, and this method requires how many parameters? Requires 1 parameter, where it is mentioned inside this pair of parentheses, and the type of the parameter is int. So when I have to call this method, I must use this name and I must give 1 integer value as the parameter. I cannot give a floating point value, I cannot give a string value, I cannot give character value, because the type of the parameter here, it is mentioned clearly, it is int. So we can pass only an integer value as parameter. Now I'm going to call this method. So see, this is the line that calls this method. See, the method name is same as it is mentioned here. Then I have to give 1 integer value as the parameter. So here num is the variable name whose type is int, so we are passing an integer value. So when this line is executed, what happens? The control of flow will be jumping towards this method. The value of num will be copied to this variable num, that is call by value. That's what we mean by call by value. The value of this parameter, the parameter that we use when we call a method, are known as actual parameters. So here this variable num is the actual parameter. The value of actual parameter is copied to the formal parameter. So here both the actual parameters and the formal parameter, both name is num, but they are different because this variable num is available only inside this method main, because it is declared here. Since this variable is declared here, this variable can be used only between this pair of curly brackets, and this variable is declared inside this pair of parentheses. That is, it belongs to this function, this method. So this variable can be used only between this pair of curly brackets as that of the method find even odd. So this is how call by value takes place. When we call a method, we are actually copying the value of actual parameter to this formal parameter. Now inside this method is checking for even number or odd number. So the same lines of code that we have used before, if num mod 2 equal to 0 if it is even, otherwise it is printing odd. Since this method does not return anything, there is no return statement. When the closing curly bracket is executed, the control will jump back to the line from which this method was invoked. This method was invoked from this line of code. So when this line is executed, the flow of control jumps towards this method, executes all lines of code. When the closing curly bracket or the return statement is executed, it jumps back to the line from which this method was invoked. So this is one example of method. You can see another example here. In this example, see, we have used two methods. First of all, I have created a class. The class name is addition. I have used two methods. One is the main method and the other method is the add method. So if I have to call this method, I need to know whether this method return anything. So here the return type is not void. That means that this method returns an integer. Okay, here is mentioned as int. That means this method returns an integer value. Then we have to mention we have to look whether this method requires any parameters. So it is clearly mentioned here, this method requires two parameters. Both of them are integers. Okay, int n1 and int n2. So both type are integers. So when I want to call this method, I need to use the method name, I need to pass two parameters, and I must be ready to catch the value this method is going to return, because it is mentioned here the return type is not void, it is int. So now we will see how we are going to call this method. See, we are writing int c equal to add a comma b. Here we didn't wrote anything like that. We simply used the method name and passed the parameter. But here we are writing int c equal to. Why we are writing like this? Because from the method header it is clear that this method is going to return an integer. So when we call this method, we are getting something back. So we need to store that value that we are getting back. For that we need to use a variable. And why the type of C is int? Because it is mentioned here this method is going to return an integer. So to store an integer, we need an integer variable itself. That is why we wrote int c equal to. C is a variable name. We can change that variable name. That's up to the programmer. But the type of this variable is C because it is mentioned here that return type of this method is int. That means this method is going to return an integer. So we need to use a variable of that type itself to store the value. So when we write this statement int c equal to add a comma b, first of all add of a comma b will be executed. So the values of a and b will be copied to n1 and n2. What is a? A is 19, b is 5. So 19 will be copied to n1 and 5 will be copied to n2. Then here we are performing some addition. Int s equal to n plus n1 plus n2. We are adding those two numbers, and c we are returning the value of s. When we return the value of s, what happens? The control is jumping back to the line from which it was called. Okay, so this is the line from which the method was invoked. So when the return statement is executed, it is jumping back to the same line from which the method was invoked. So this value of s will replace this add of a comma b after the execution of the method. So I repeat once again. When this line of code is executed, the flow of control will jump towards this method. Value of a is copied to n1, value of b is copied to n2. Then s is declared, performs the addition. Then we are returning the value of s. So when this value of s is returned, it is going back to this line of code, and add of a comma b gets replaced by the value of s. So this line of code becomes int c equal to s. So that is similar to an assignment statement. So value of s, whatever may be the value of s, that is assigned to c. Then we are printing the value of c. So the difference between these two programs is, here we have written a method that does not return any parameter. So the return type is void. But here the method returns an integer variable. So the return type is mentioned as int. Once we have mentioned the return type as int, that is, once we have mentioned the return type as anything other than void, then the last statement of the method must be a return statement. Otherwise it will show an error. That's a common rule that we know, right? If the method does not return anything, then the return type must be void. If the method returns something, then the return type must be mentioned as the type of the value the method is going to return. Once we mention a data type here other than void, then there must be a return statement, and that must be the last line of code. Why we are saying that return statement must be the last line of code? Because once the return statement is executed, the control will jump back to the line from which the method was invoked. So even if we write so many lines of code after return statement, those lines of code will never get executed. That is why we are saying If there is a return statement, the return statement must be the last line of code inside the method. And when we have to use a return statement, when the return type is mentioned as something else other than void. That is, we decided that our method is going to return something, so we have to mention what type of value the method is going to return along with the method name. Then in that case we have to use the return statement, otherwise the program will lead to an error. I hope that is clear. So that is it. We shall conclude for now. So in this video lecture we discussed about methods, how to create methods, what is method signature, what is method header, what all things we need to know when we have to call a method. Before we have to call a method, we need to know the method name, whether the method returns anything, and the parameter list of the method, etc. And we also saw some examples in which we have discussed how to write methods and how to call methods. That's all. Thank you so much.